He only said it once, and he didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. "I want a divorce." Vivienne Hartley set down the mug she'd been holding. Chamomile, the kind she drank every Sunday morning, and waited for him to say something else. He didn't. He just kept scrolling, thumb moving up the screen in that slow, bored way he had, like he was scanning headlines that didn't matter. She'd been married to Thomas Hartley for 9 years. She knew every version of him. The man who cried at his father's funeral and tried to hide it. The man who burned toast every single time, but refused to admit the toaster was broken. The man who held her hand in the car without thinking about it. The way people do when touching someone has become as automatic as breathing. She knew him. And she knew, standing in their kitchen in the gray November light, with steam still rising from her untouched tea, that this wasn't a conversation. He had already decided. He was just delivering. "Okay," she said. She didn't know why she said that. It wasn't what she meant. But her voice came out flat and quiet, and the words sat between them like something neither of them wanted to pick up. Thomas finally looked at her then, and the expression on his face, the brief flash of surprise, maybe even relief, told her everything she hadn't wanted to know. He had expected a fight. He had braced for one. The fact that she didn't give him one seemed to throw him off, and for just a moment she saw him clearly. A man who had already rehearsed a version of this scene where she was the difficult one. She had just taken that from him. She didn't know if that was strength or shock, but she held on to the mug and didn't move. The papers came 3 weeks later through his lawyer, a man named Gerald Price, whose emails were impeccably worded and who seemed to understand that his job was to be a wall between Thomas and any form of accountability. Vivienne read through the documents at her kitchen table. Her kitchen table, although she wasn't sure how much longer it would be hers. With a yellow highlighter and a legal pad and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in the body, not in the mind. She had given up her position at a Vancouver architectural firm to follow Thomas to Toronto when his firm relocated. She had turned down a partnership offer. She had done these things because they were married, and that's what you did. And also because Thomas had stood in their old living room and told her he would never forget it. That he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted it. She highlighted that clause in the agreement. The one about the division of assets. She read it 3 times. Then she set down the highlighter and sat very still. He was offering her the contents of their joint savings account and the furniture she'd brought from Vancouver. The condo, the one she'd helped select, whose layout she had reimagined so it actually functioned as a home rather than an investment property, was to remain with him. The company shares she'd been gifted 2 years into the marriage, during a period when the firm was in a rough patch, and Thomas had said it was symbolic, that it meant they were in it together. Those were listed under assets subject to dispute. She called her sister in Halifax. Her sister, Renee, not from the list, Renee Hartley now but born Renee Holloway, picked up on the second ring and listened for a very long time without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have and which Vivienne had always been grateful for. "What do you need?" Renee asked when she finally stopped. "I don't know yet," Vivienne said. "Do you need a lawyer?" "Yes." "Then get one before you sign anything." She didn't sign anything. She sat on the papers for 2 weeks, which made Gerald Price send increasingly polite and increasingly pointed emails, all of which she read and none of which she answered. She was looking for a lawyer who wasn't connected to anyone in Thomas's orbit, which in Toronto was harder than it sounded. She found one eventually, a woman named Constance Obi, who had an office on King Street West, and who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and who looked at the settlement documents and said, with no particular emotion, "This is designed to look fair, but it isn't," Vivienne said. "It's structured to discourage you from fighting it," Constance said. "The shares are the most important item here. What do you know about your husband's company?" "I know it's doing well," Vivienne said. "Better than it was when he gave me those shares." Constance looked at her over the glasses. "How much better?" Vivienne pulled up a number on her phone. She had been watching the firm's performance reports out of habit, out of the same instinct that had made her track the condo's market value and keep a folder of receipts she never needed. She showed Constance the screen. Constance looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. In the meantime, Thomas had moved Joanna Fairfax into a Yorkville apartment. Vivienne found out through a friend, and then she found out through other friends. And then she stopped answering her phone for a week, because there is only so many times you can say, "I'm fine," before the words stop meaning anything at all. Joanna was 31. She worked in communications. She had met Thomas at a conference in Montreal in the spring, which was also when Vivienne now understood. Thomas had become distant and preoccupied in a way she'd attributed to work stress. She had made him dinner during that period. She had asked if he was sleeping all right. She had done all the small, practical acts of care that you do for someone you love when you think they are tired, not realizing you were tending to a man who was already halfway out the door. She didn't cry about Joanna. She had cried about Thomas, about the marriage, about the years she had rearranged her own life to build something with him. Joanna felt like a separate category of loss. Not grief, exactly, but the particular degradation of finding out you had been deceived. So thoroughly you'd nursed the deceiver through it. She went back to work. She had been doing freelance consultations for smaller developers since the move to Toronto, careful work that kept her skills current without demanding the full weight of a firm position. She called her old contact at a development group called Northmark Properties and asked if they had anything in the pipeline that needed a structural eye. They did. She said yes. She drove to the site in Etobicoke on a cold morning in early December and stood in a half-finished building with drawings in her hand and felt for the first time in months like a person with a use. The project lead on the Northmark site was a man named Wesley Drum. Not from the list, Wesley Drum, who had the slightly distracted air of someone who is always calculating something in the background of every conversation. He was quiet in the way that specific, competent people tend to be quiet, not unfriendly, just economical. He didn't ask her personal questions. He asked about load-bearing walls and the variance on the eastern elevation, and whether she thought the original contractor had cut corner on the insulation specifications. And Vivienne gave him real answers, and he listened to them, which was, in the context of the last several months, almost startling. She was not thinking about Wesley Drum in any particular way. She was thinking about settlement percentages and her sister's voice on the phone and the specific weight of a 9-year marriage that had ended with a man who didn't look up from his screen. Wesley Drum was simply a person on a job site who treated her like a professional, and right now that was enough. The holiday season came and went in the way that holidays do when your life is undergoing reconstruction. Present but muted, like a radio playing in another room. She spent Christmas in Halifax with Renee and Renee's husband and their 2 kids, who were 7 and 4, and had no interest in adult unhappiness, which was exactly what she needed. She came back to Toronto in January with something that wasn't quite resilience, but was in the same neighborhood. In February, she found out she was pregnant. She sat on the edge of the bathtub in her temporary rental apartment on Roncesvalles. She'd moved out of the condo in November. She hadn't been able to stay, and stared at the test. Then she looked up at the ceiling. Then she looked at the test again. The timing was precise in the way that bad timing always is. The last time she and Thomas had been in the same room without lawyers had been in September, 3 days before he'd said the word divorce over his phone. They had been civil. They had gone through a box of items in the spare room. He had made coffee. It had been terrible and ordinary, and she hadn't thought about it again until this moment. She called Renee. "Okay," Renee said, after a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. "Okay," Vivienne said. "Okay, that's where we are. What do you need?" What Vivienne needed was several weeks to simply hold the information without having to do anything with it. The divorce proceedings were still ongoing. The shares were still in dispute. Thomas's lawyer was still sending emails in that impeccably courteous tone that felt every time like being handed a shiv wrapped in a doily. She was in no position to tell Thomas about the pregnancy, not because she was hiding it, but because the shape of her life felt so unstable that adding this into the legal machinery terrified her. Constance had told her to hold off on anything that wasn't strictly necessary until the asset question was resolved. So she held off. She went to her appointments alone. She learned, at 11 weeks, that she was carrying twins. She sat in the ultrasound room afterward and looked at the printout and thought about all the ways a person's life can pivot on a single ordinary morning, the way a before and an after can be created without any dramatic gesture, Just the quiet accumulation of things that were always true and that you are only now beginning to see. She told no one else. She went back to the Northmark site and did her job. She was 22 weeks along in March when Thomas found out. Not from her. From a mutual acquaintance, the kind of city that Toronto is, where 6 degrees become 2. He called her directly, which he hadn't done since August. She let it go to voicemail. He called again, she answered. Is it true? He asked. Is what true? She said, not as a question. A pause. Vivienne. Yes, she said. It's true. Another pause, longer. Then, we need to talk. We are talking through our lawyers, she said. If you have something to say, you can say it through Gerald. She hung up and sat very still for a while. Then she called Constance. What followed was the most specific kind of chaos. The kind that looks bureaucratic from the outside but feels, when you are inside it, like every surface in your life has become unsteady at once. Thomas, through Gerald, began suggesting amendments to the settlement. He wanted provisions. He wanted access terms included. He wanted things reframed in ways that Constance said, without expression, were designed to reduce Vivienne's structural position before the children were even born. He's trying to establish leverage before you have it, Constance said. He's their father, Vivienne said. Yes, Constance said. And he's also a man whose lawyer has been working for 3 months to ensure you receive the minimum viable portion of a 9-year marriage. Both things are true simultaneously. She knew that. She had always known that, in the abstract. But there is a difference between knowing something intellectually and watching it move toward you. Thomas had his reasons. She no longer cared about his reasons. What she cared about was what came next. She was 7 months pregnant, enormous in the specific way that carrying twins makes you enormous, sitting in Constance's office on a Tuesday morning when Constance said, I need to tell you something. She looked up. The shares, Constance said. I've been reviewing the company's reporting structure for the last quarter. There's a discrepancy in the documentation that was originally used to value them at the time of the settlement offer. Vivienne waited. The shares were deliberately undervalued by approximately 40%, Constance said. This wasn't a calculation error. The room was very quiet. Outside, King Street was doing what King Street always does in February, grinding, gray, indifferent. Who valued them? Vivienne asked. The firm Thomas hired, Constance said. The one connected to his company's existing accounting structure. Vivienne sat with this for a moment. So someone in his firm produced a document that made the shares worth less, so he could keep them at a discount in the settlement. That is what the evidence currently suggests, Constance said. And Thomas? Constance looked at her carefully. Whether Thomas directed this or simply benefited from it, that's a question we will need to answer. She drove home. She did not cry. She sat in the parking lot of her building for 11 minutes and looked at the steering wheel and thought about the 9 years and the condo and the chamomile tea and the way he had said it once and not looked up. She thought about the partnership she hadn't taken. She thought about her daughters. It was daughters. She had found out at 20 weeks. She was having daughters, and what she would tell them someday about this period, what language she would use to make it make sense. Then she went upstairs and ate soup and went to sleep. The twins were born in April, 6 weeks earlier than expected, in a controlled delivery at Mount Sinai. They were small and loud and entirely themselves from the first moment. Vivienne held them in the recovery room with Renee beside her and looked at their faces and felt something she did not have words for. A kind of terrible, complete love that had nothing to do with any of the events of the past year and also somehow contained all of them. She named them Adeline and Fern. Adeline for her grandmother. Fern for no particular reason except that it felt right. Thomas showed up at the hospital. She had not told him when the delivery was happening, but he had called Renee, and Renee had told him the girls were here, that they were healthy, that Vivienne was recovering. And that was all Renee had told him, because Renee was loyal and also not naive. He stood in the hallway outside the room. Vivienne's nurse, a woman named Patrice, who had the kind of calm authority that should be studied and replicated, came to ask if Vivienne wanted a visitor. Vivienne looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at her daughters. Not today, she said. Thomas left. She didn't know what he felt about that. She was too tired to wonder. She spent 6 weeks in Halifax. Renee's house had a guest room and a yard. and 2 children who adored the babies with the ferocity that only young children and dogs can sustain. And Vivienne slept in 4-hour increments and ate whatever was put in front of her, and slowly, in a way she hadn't expected, began to feel like herself again. Not the self from before. That self had signed herself away to a life she'd thought was permanent, but a self that was coming into focus, sharper than before, less willing to negotiate certain things away. She went back to Toronto in June. The divorce was finalized in August. Constance had spent 4 months building the case around the share valuation, and Thomas's lawyers had eventually calculated that fighting it would cost more than conceding it. The settlement, revised, included the full and correct value of the shares, plus an additional sum representing the pension contributions she had foregone when she left the Vancouver firm. Gerald Price emails have become noticeably shorter. She did not celebrate. She sat in Constance's office and signed the documents and shook Constance's hand, and walked out onto King Street in August sunshine and stood there for a moment, blinking. The access arrangement was agreed upon separately. She had not fought Thomas on the girls. She had never wanted to. He was their father, whatever else he was. Adeline and Fern would know him. She had insisted on primary residence, and had gotten it. She had insisted on decision-making authority for medical and educational matters, and had gotten that too. Thomas had agreed to everything with a directness that surprised her, as if without the money question between them he was, in that respect at least, trying. She went back to work properly in September, not freelance, not consultations. She called a firm called Meridian & Vance, who had recruited her twice in the last 2 years, and she said she was ready if the offer still stood. It stood. She started on a Thursday. Adeline and Fern went to a childcare center 3 blocks from the Meridian office. She dropped them off on her first morning and stood at the glass door watching them for a moment. Each in the arms of someone new, each already looking at something more interesting than her. She felt the sharp edge of that, the way they were already becoming people who didn't need her every moment, and she held it, and then she went to work. Wesley Drum called her in October. Not about work. She'd finished with the Northmark project in the spring. He called to ask if she would like to have dinner. He said it plainly and without performance, the same way he discussed load-bearing walls and insulation specifications. And she was so surprised by the directness that she didn't say anything for a moment. "You can say no," he said. "That's also fine." "I'm not going to say no," she said. I have a complicated schedule." "I have a flexible one," he said. She met him for dinner at a small restaurant in Trinity Bellwoods. She told him about the twins, about the divorce, because there didn't seem to be any point in not, and he listened in the way she had noticed him listening on job sites, fully present, not waiting for his turn to speak. He didn't say he was sorry or tell her she was brave, or offer any of the well-meaning things people offer when they don't know what else to do. He asked if the girls were sleeping. He asked what they were like. He seemed genuinely interested in the specifics. She told him about Adeline, who was loud and opinionated and had already mastered a particular expression of disapproval that she had definitely not inherited from Thomas. She told him about Fern, who was quieter, who studied everything with an intensity that made Vivienne think she was cataloging the world for later use. She talked about her daughters for probably longer than was reasonable for a first dinner, and Wesley Drum listened to all of it and asked follow-up questions and didn't once look at his phone. She drove home and put the girls to bed. They were 6 months old. They didn't sleep through the night yet. Nothing about the schedule was under control, and sat in her kitchen afterward with the same kind of chamomile tea she'd been drinking on that Sunday morning last November. The mug was different. The kitchen was different. The life was substantially different. It was hers, though. She had gotten that back, or built it, or both. She wasn't sure what Wesley Drum was yet. She wasn't sure she needed to know. What she knew was that she had 2 daughters who were becoming people at a startling speed, and a job that used the parts of her that had been going unused, and a lawyer she trusted, and a sister who answered on the second ring. She knew that she had read through a settlement document with a yellow highlighter and not signed it. She knew that she had stood in a hospital room and made a choice. She thought sometimes about who she'd been in that kitchen with the tea. The woman who had said okay. She understood that woman. She didn't regret her, but she was done inhabiting her. Adeline and Fern woke at 3 in the morning, as they always did. Vivienne went to them in the dark. She picked up Fern first, because Fern was louder when she had to wait, and she sat in the rocking chair by the window, and held her daughter and looked out at the city. Toronto in October. The streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, the CN Tower visible in the distance against the low clouds, and it was not a neat or simple life. It was not what she had planned. But it was real, and it was moving forward, and there was no one who could take it from her now.